Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter is from New Zealand. Met her last night. It was such a great pleasure to meet you. Caroline Atford, who's the Managing Director of Nielsen Media in New Zealand. She is addressing the issue of readership currency, the journey to mixed sample methodology. Very, very interesting. She has over 20 years of experience and working from a very different market and therefore with some interesting experiences. Please join me in welcoming Caroline Atford.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I am indeed all the way from over in New Zealand, and this is, as I said, my very first trip to Africa, just like James from yesterday. I can honestly say once I make my very long trip back home, I will be sitting my husband down and working out how to convince him to come back for a very nice holiday over here at some point. Thank you. So what I'm taking you through today is some of the work we've done with our readership currency in New Zealand. We've gone through quite a large journey to evolve it from a completely face-to-face methodology through to a mixed methodology. It was quite a journey and it has taken us quite some time. And what I'm going to take you through today is 3 of the key lessons that we learned on the way. There are lots of challenges, but these were the 3 standouts that I'd like to take you through. So just firstly, just to set the scene, I'll just give you an idea of how the readership currency works in the New Zealand market. The currency itself is measured within something called our Consumer and Media Insights database. The core part of the survey is where we ask all the readership metrics. Then following on from that, we also gather information from those respondents that give us really in-depth information about them as a consumer. We ask them over 200 attitudinal statements, so we get a really good view of how they think and feel, which gives you a really good way of breaking out the basic age and gender profiles and giving a really good segment to the database. Included in that, we ask information along many categories. Things like sports, how they travel, where they go shopping, how their finances work, etc. And within the shopping and retail aspect, we also include a lot of product information. So we not only know where they're going shopping, we also get to understand what brands they are aligned to. With all that information gathered in there, we then apply some fusion as well. Jonathan took you through the world of fusion yesterday. What we do in the New Zealand market is we bring in our TV currency measurement and also our digital currency measurement, and we fuse that into that database. So it makes it a truly 360-degree view of our consumer and how they interact with media. This database has become a very pivotal part of our media owners and advertising agencies' planning and target management process. So on to the journey. All good journeys start with a bit of history. Nielsen has measured the readership currency in the New Zealand market for over 30 years. So it started before I even started with Nielsen. At its core, it's a face-to-face survey that required an interviewer to knock on doors, find the right applicant in the household, and then sit down with that person and take them through the survey and complete it for them. An important part of the whole survey was the use of mastheads. Now, mastheads, for those who aren't involved in a readership currency, are quite simply a card with an imprint of the title masthead of each of the magazines and newspapers that we measure. Those cards are handed to the respondent and they filter through and hand back to the interviewer all the titles that they have read with, and the interviewer then takes them on the journey to ask all the other readership metrics. In the 1990s, early 1990s this was, we added a self-completion diary to this whole process. So once the interview is completed, the respondent then is handed a diary, and that's what we use to collect all the other consumer information I mentioned on the previous slide. That's what really fills in all that in-depth information about the shopping behaviours, where they go and how they think. In the early 1990s, we launched this as our Panorama database. We brought the 2 data sets together, provided one database, And that's the journey we're on for many, many years. By the time we got to 2009, as you all know, the digital world had had some impact on what was happening in the media space. For the newspaper and magazine industry, it was certainly introducing a lot of new and challenging environments for them to battle with. But digital was also starting to change the way people were conducting their surveys. We were seeing more and more surveys that were being distributed through a digital or online environment, with the respondents completing it that way, and then all the information being filtered back. So the media industry, or the print industry in New Zealand, decided maybe it was time to look at what we were doing with the readership currency and apply the same approach. So they formed a wider industry group. All the major New Zealand publishers formed together with some representation from the advertising agency group, and they put together a pitch with that as a focus. They sent that out. They made it very clear that they wanted to really assess what they could do in a digital environment. They wanted to make sure that they maintained a masthead approach to their whole currency. They also wanted to be very clear that they wanted to continue to have all that consumer information. And in fact, they probably wanted more. As with all pitches, it was a long and intensive process to go through. Pleasingly for Nielsen, we were reassigned as the currency provider for the New Zealand market, but with some changes in the plan. We were going to relaunch the Panorama database, and we were going to call it Consumer Media Insights, and that did happen. We continue to bring together all that very deep information for the consumer alongside the readership currency. We continue to fuse TV and TV into it, and we also introduced digital into the fusion process. We added another fused database into the process called Household Expenditure. This is a government-based survey that's run in New Zealand, and it gives a very in-depth view of the full spend that occurs in a household across a week. The other key focus was that we were going to transition from a face-to-face methodology to a digital methodology. And the initial plan for that it would take us about 2 to 3 years to do that. We sat down, we laid out that plan, we confirmed the 2 to 3 year process, and we all agreed we'd fire ahead. Comes my spoiler alert, we did not go fully digital in 2 to 3 years. We thought this was a great idea and we proceeded with it, but we certainly had some lessons to learn. Which brings me to lesson number 1. Put the respondent experience first. Now, I sit here in a room full of researchers and I'm pretty sure everybody's going, well, of course, put the respondent experience first. But sadly for us, the lovely smiling face you see here on the screen is not a reflection of what our respondents were dealing with. There weren't a lot of smiles in it. Our first approach was to look at our face-to-face survey, and we translated it straight into a digital format. And we sent that out to respondents. We underestimated the impact that interviewer had in this process. When we looked at all the other digital surveys that we were conducting, there was another big key difference. Most of those were 5 or 10 minutes long. Something that includes all the readership metrics in it is going to take at least half an hour. And we realised that what the interviewer did with one of these long surveys is they not only helped the respondent to complete the survey and get through any challenging questions, they also kept them engaged and made sure they completed the survey. Our first test, we had very few people complete the survey. And those that did manage to get through the end were pretty brutal in their feedback about how hard it was and how difficult it was. So part of this first lesson was this could not just be translated. It was a long and complex survey, and we couldn't just translate it straight into a digital environment. The experience was bad, and if the experience is bad with respondents, you are not going to get good data. If they're not going to complete the survey, you're going to get even less data. So we sat down with the industry and went, right, we need to redesign the survey. And when I say redesign the survey, I actually mean design the survey. We actually needed to start from scratch and work through and design a very solid online survey that was going to be able to manage the complexity of a readership currency, as well as engage with the respondent and enable them to complete the half hour that was required. It needed to be visually appealing, and it needed to be easy to follow. So by this point, we're a good year into our 2 to 3 year timeframe. We sat down with the industry and we all went, right, that's okay, we've learnt some lessons. We'll now do a design process. And we'll just shift the 2 to 3 year timeframe along a little bit. And that was the intention and that was the plan. However, Mother Nature had some other news for us. I don't know how many people know the country that is New Zealand, but it is built on quite a lot of fault lines and a lot of volcanoes. And in early 2011, we were hit with a catastrophic earthquake. It hit Christchurch, which is our third largest city and our largest city in our South Island. It was absolutely disastrous. It completely wiped out Christchurch City as we know it today. We lost many, many lives, and as you can imagine, it impacted the entire country. Our priorities changed overnight. Our first priority, obviously, was to contact all our interviewers in that area and make sure they were okay. And I'm pleased to say that they were. They were very, very upset and they were very, very stressed, but they were okay. The second thing we did was obviously discontinue all interviewing in and around that area. It just was not the thing to do. It was to come in there and start to ask people about readership when they were going through something as major as this. So we completely pulled out of that area. The impact of this earthquake has been long-standing, and in fact today Christchurch still isn't the same city it was prior to that earthquake. So we had some very important and serious discussions with our industry, and we did a big step back and said this is not the time to make any changes. All we need to do now is manage the survey as it is and actually continue on and handle the sample that we're going to have to deal with for a little while. And a little bit into it, we then had to actually completely reset our geographical areas for the South Island and adjust accordingly. This took us quite some time. This was a couple of years of work just to maintain the currency as it was. So a few years into it, and it was a few years, it wasn't until 2013 that we actually started to have the conversations again with the industry about what we needed to do. And obviously the first thing we needed to do was, once again, as we had discussed earlier, and we'd had our lesson number one, was sit down and design a survey. And we did this. And we got a design team in. We actually included design help from some of our clients as well. They were doing a lot of digital surveys, they had a lot of creative teams, so we brought as much different knowledge around the table as we could to bring together to work out how we could create this survey. We all had experience in putting together a digital survey, but nobody had experience in putting one as long as this and as complex as this. As I mentioned earlier, when we started this whole process, the industry were very, very clear that they wanted to continue with mastheads. Now, mastheads were a challenge to get into an online survey, but we managed it eventually, and this screenshot here shows what it looks like to the respondent as they work their way through. We put the mastheads into groups that make sense, and the respondent simply has to click on the title that they have said that they've seen and that they have read. It's a very clear approach. They click on it, there's a very clear green tick to say that they have selected that title, and then from there the survey takes them through and asks just the questions on the titles that they've selected. Again, sounds very straightforward, but filtering was a very, very big part of the process through this. The other aspect with the filtering was to make sure that, because it was a half-hour survey, there was no situation where a respondent had some questions very early on in the survey where they had clearly said a yes or a no, that they then only got the questions that were applicable to them later on in the survey. It was a very key pain point that we discovered in our first foray in this. And another very simple thing that we included was a time bar. And it sounds very straightforward and very easy to do, but as I mentioned, this survey was taking people about half an hour, and we found that once we had a time bar in there and that they could clearly see how far they'd come and how far they had to go, we actually held their engagement, and we had a much better job of getting them to complete the survey. So finally, we now had a survey that we could use. We were very proud of it. We had a digital survey we could use in the readership environment. We were ready to fire ahead, and we did some testing. We worked with our largest online panel sample provider in New Zealand, and we set up a full pilot. And this time, the feedback was outstanding. Now, you all know, in an environment we work in, we get negative feedback very quickly. But this time, we were getting positive feedback. So you can imagine how excited we were. I think to this date, my favourite comment is the one that says, "This is one of the best surveys I've ever done." Really, wow, this was a half-hour survey, and this was the best survey. So we were very proud of what we had achieved, and the industry group were very, very pleased with the result. So we now had a pilot, and we were having people responding and completing the survey. And as I mentioned, we were using New Zealand's largest online panel sample provider. They had a good, robust sample to select from, and the response was working well. But as we journeyed through the pilot, we came to lesson number 2. Whilst it was a very large sample to select from and to recruit from, and we were getting respondents, we were actually struggling to get the quotas we needed for a readership currency. Bearing in mind, this is a readership currency, so it needs to reflect the New Zealand population as much as it can. And even at our base age, gender, geographical quotas, we were having some struggles. We were struggling with younger people, we were getting a lot more female than we were male, and we were leaning towards lower socio and lower income. So as this was a pilot, we were able to make some changes and do things as we go through. So we worked through some other ideas of how we could recruit. And we introduced an old favourite really, computer-aided telephone interviewing to do some recruitment. We used just a landline system for this first foray into it. And what we did is we targeted the areas of the quotas that we were really struggling with using the telephone recruitment. Once we got those people recruited, we could then just simply send them an email with a link to the survey, and they could still complete in a digital environment. That worked really, really well. The two samples and the two recruitment processes complemented each other beautifully. And by the end of it all, we realised that the best way to do this was, as we were going forward, we were definitely going to make sure we did the panel sample first and then follow up with the back half of the field work with some telephone recruitment so we could meet our quotas. It all made sense, and everybody was happy with the sample we were getting. As I said, this was a long journey. We've only now got to this point. We've actually finally got some data to look at. I'd just like to point out, this was the industry as well. There was a lot of looking at data through this whole process. So we got some data, which very quickly brought us to the third and final lesson I'm going to take you through today. Account for biases. On the surface of it all looked great. Our quotas were met. And then we started looking into the data and comparing that data that we were getting in a digital environment with what we already had in field as the currency, but also with other parts of the information we were collecting. We were comparing it to the Department of Stats. We used our TV establishment survey just to do some logic checks. And the data wasn't quite making sense to us. For the readership titles, we were seeing bounces all over the place. Some titles had huge growth, and we knew that didn't make sense in the environment we were in. Others had massive declines suddenly, literally overnight, as compared to the currency. When we looked at the things like household behaviours, the way people were engaging things like our attitudinal statements, and we were beginning to see things that we just weren't comfortable with. We knew if we were going to go fully digital at this point, we were going to have some massive changes to the data, and we would have to be prepared for that, and we'd have to be able to answer the questions. So we got data science involved. Jonathan would say we probably should have got data science involved quite a lot earlier in the process. However, we finally got data science involved, and they started to pull the data apart for us and started to look at it closely. And there were a few interesting things that we saw. The very obvious one is that at this point in time, over 15% of the New Zealand market didn't have broadband access. And yet we were thinking about measuring a readership currency with just people who had to have broadband access. So that was a big group we were missing. And not only was it a group we were missing, they were a group that did tend to be higher readership users, higher readers of print. But there was also things like the lower internet users. We were struggling to get those people as well. And they are also an important group to have included in here. And really interestingly, again, the younger people were still a bit of a challenge. And whilst we were doing quite a good job of recruiting them, it would appear that for them, they'd already moved past the email stage of life, and they weren't very good at going and actually checking their email and actually following up on responding to the survey. They were very hard to get to complete the survey. So we could see why there were some challenges with the data. So we worked through the data science, and we definitely obviously worked through with the industry. And data science came up with a solution of, well, instead of jumping the whole big jump through to 100% digital, why don't we look at a mix here? We've got 3 good sets of data. They've all got advantages. So why don't we make the best of all 3 and bring them together and create a mixed methodology? And that's what we did. And the first approach to doing this was a recommendation of actually maintaining 75% of our currency with a face-to-face model and introducing 25% of our currency using digital. And of that 25%, 35% was going to be recruited via CATI. We finally launched that in Q1 in 2016. Takes a full year for the entire methodology to roll out. So by Q1 2017, we had the full methodology in place. It wasn't long after that I was asked by somebody whether I thought it was a successful launch. And I said yes, it was. And my reasoning behind it was not dissimilar to what I mentioned before about positive and negative feedback. The industry were all very aware this was coming. All our advertising agencies and all our other advertiser clients knew we were making some substantial changes, and not one of them had concerns with the data as we rolled it out. So that reassured us that we'd made the right decision and that we had done this the right way. We have moved on a little bit since then. In 2018, we did extend the digital aspect to 45% of our currency, and we are still maintaining that 35% of that is recruited through CATI. We also introduced to the CATI piece mobile phones to the landline mix. In New Zealand, there are less and less households with landlines, so we needed to boost it up with mobile. We saw very quickly that that was a great way of getting the younger people. That really helped our younger audience for recruitment dramatically. So we launched with that in 2018. And again, the rollout has been successful and smooth, and the industry is very comfortable with what they're seeing with the readership currency and also with the wider CMI. So, just as a wrap up, I'd just like to point out, I've just shared 3 of the key lessons we learned along the way. Absolute no-brainer, obviously. Respondent experience first. But don't underestimate what the changes will be when you're moving a currency in particular. Bringing in a digital recruitment approach to the mix is a really good idea. And online sample panels are a really good starting point. But do consider enhancing them with a CATI recruitment. It really does a good job of balancing out that data. And obviously account for biases. What that really should say is bring in your data science team early in the mix. Jonathan's smiling now. So establish a new mix. Be considered with it. The other lesson I would say, I know this took us a long time, and we had a couple of years that were completely out of our control, but I would definitely recommend doing it slowly. Whilst we had a lot of stress and a lot of time and a lot of resources doing this behind the scenes, as far as the wider industry was concerned, it literally happened overnight. And they think it was a very smooth rollout, and that to me is the ultimate result for it all. And that's all the lessons I have to share with you today. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Caroline for a rigorous presentation. Always reminds us about the importance of Nielsen in making sure that the basics are taken care of in research, whatever technology we use, whatever developments there may be, but the basics remain very, very important. Thank you for that wonderful presentation.